It was the kind of evening that lingers in memory. Humid air heavy with the scent of pine, the faint buzz of cicadas echoing through the quiet back roads of central Mississippi. June 12, 2004. 19-year-old Lacey Coleman was driving home from her shift at a grocery store in Brookhaven, a small town where everyone knew each other by name, where Sunday church was still the heartbeat of the week. She called her mom at 9:17 p.m., said she'd stop by the gas station for a soda and be home in 15 minutes. That call would be the last time anyone heard her voice. Lacey was the youngest of 3 children, a bright college freshman at Copiah Lincoln Community College. She dreamed of studying early childhood education. Her friends described her as sunshine, the kind of person who remembered birthdays, left kind notes in lockers, and always had music playing. She loved driving the family's old white Toyota Corolla with the windows rolled down, hair whipping in the wind, singing along to country songs on the radio. She had a boyfriend, Evan Reed, but they'd recently been on a break. Something her mom later said had left her quiet lately, but still hopeful. When midnight came and Lacey still hadn't returned home, her mother, Darlene Coleman, assumed her daughter had gone to stay with a friend. But by morning the worry set in. Her bed was still untouched. Her phone went straight to voicemail and no one had seen her since she left work the night before. By 10 a.m., Darlene walked into the Brookhaven Police Department and filed a missing person report. Detective Carl Denham was assigned to the case. Within hours, search parties were organized. Dozens of locals gathered at the community center before fanning out across back roads, creeks, and wooded areas. Lacey's car was found 2 days later, abandoned on an old gravel service road just outside town. The keys were still in the ignition. The driver's seat pushed slightly back, as if someone taller had been there. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, cash still inside, but her phone was missing. Tire tracks near the ditch suggested another vehicle had stopped there too. The discovery sent a chill through Brookhaven. People who'd always left doors unlocked started double-checking them. Parents stopped letting their kids walk home alone. For weeks, the search expanded across Lincoln County. Flyers covered telephone poles, grocery store bulletin boards, and church entrances. Lacey's photo, smiling bright-eyed, became impossible to miss. But the longer she stayed missing, the heavier the silence grew. Then, in late July, a farmer clearing brush, along a rural stretch of Highway 583, stumbled upon something half buried beneath the soil. Then a torn piece of denim and a silver bracelet engraved with the letter L. The area was quickly sealed off, and what searchers found there would haunt the town for years. Shallow earth had concealed a shallow grave. The medical examiner later confirmed what no one wanted to believe. The remains were Lacey's. Her cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, and there was evidence of sexual assault. DNA samples were collected from the scene and sent to the state crime lab. But back in 2004, Mississippi's forensic technology wasn't yet advanced enough to extract a full profile from the degraded evidence. The partial DNA sequence was entered into CODIS, but there were no matches. The funeral drew nearly half the town. At the service, Darlene clutched her daughter's framed graduation photo while Pastor Jerome Hayes told mourners, "We may not see justice now, but justice has a way of finding its own time." Afterward, Darlene stopped speaking to reporters. She withdrew from community events, stopped teaching Sunday school, and visited Lacey's grave every week without fail. The family home grew quiet. Her father, Ray Coleman, went back to his work at the lumber mill, but never smiled the same way again. Her brother, Kyle, joined the army 2 years later, saying he needed to get away from a town that only reminded him of what they lost. The investigation carried on for months, but leads dried up. Detectives interviewed more than 80 people, including co-workers and ex-boyfriends, but no one stood out. Rumors spread. Talk of a drifter seen near the gas station that night, a strange pickup parked by the service road, but every possible suspect was cleared. By the end of 2005, the case had gone cold. The evidence box, labeled Coleman Lacey Homicide, was placed on a shelf deep inside the Lincoln County evidence room, collecting dust. Years passed. The small-town grief became something unspoken, like an old scar everyone had learned to live around. Darlene kept her daughter's room exactly as it had been, bed made, candles on the dresser, the scent of vanilla faint, but still there. Each year on June 12th, she placed fresh lilies on Lacey's grave and whispered the same words, "I'm still waiting." By 2019, 15 years had gone by with no movement in the case. Detective Denham had retired, and a younger investigator, Sergeant Michelle Turner, inherited the cold case files. Turner was known for her determination. She'd been part of a neighboring county's task force that used genealogy databases to solve a 1998 homicide. When she opened the Coleman file, she said later, "Something about it just didn't sit right. The lack of motive, the abandoned car, the precision of the burial. It felt personal, not random." In early 2023, the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation received funding to retest old DNA evidence using a new technique called forensic genetic genealogy, which could compare even tiny degraded samples to publicly available ancestry databases. Turner submitted Lacey's samples immediately. Weeks turned into months of waiting, but then in October 2023, an email arrived with a subject line that made her hands tremble. Possible familial DNA match, Coleman case. The name attached to that file would send shockwaves through Brookhaven. When the email arrived, Sergeant Michelle Turner sat alone in her office at the Brookhaven Police Department, a cup of cold coffee beside her, and the Coleman case file open on her desk. The message was from the Mississippi State Crime Lab's genealogy liaison, and it contained a single line that stopped her breath short. Partial familial DNA connection identified. Probable relative of interest, Brian Haskins. At first, the name didn't register. Turner ran it through local databases, cross-referencing old employment records, criminal history, and address logs. Then it hit her. Haskins had been a Brookhaven resident in the early 2000s. He'd lived less than 2 miles from the grocery store where Lacey worked. Back then he was 28, a delivery driver known to many in town. He'd moved out of state around 2006. Right after the case went cold, the genealogy report revealed that DNA found under Lacey's fingernails partially matched genetic material voluntarily, submitted to a public ancestry database by a woman identified as Melissa Haskins, Brian's cousin. Investigators followed the line backward, tracing the family tree, narrowing it down through relatives, and eventually isolating Brian as the most likely biological source. Turner didn't move too quickly. She'd seen DNA leads fall apart before. But something about this one felt different. The probability index exceeded 99.7%. That was enough to reopen the case. She briefed her captain, and within days, a task force was quietly assembled. They started digging. Brian had left Mississippi in 2006 and settled in Birmingham, Alabama, where he worked as a mechanic. He had no major criminal record, just a few misdemeanors, minor altercations, nothing that screamed predator. But when detectives pulled his work history from the early 2000s, they noticed a disturbing overlap. The night Lacey vanished, Brian's delivery route placed him near the gas station where she'd last been seen. The timestamps on his delivery logs, 8:50 p.m., lined up perfectly with her final phone call. Turner requested a warrant for a covert DNA collection. In November 2023, Alabama law enforcement followed Brian to a diner on the outskirts of Birmingham. When he finished his meal, he left behind a used coffee cup and a straw. Technicians collected both items, sealed them, and shipped them to the Mississippi lab. 2 weeks later, the results came back. A perfect match to the unknown male DNA profile found on Lacey's clothing and under her nails. After 19 years, they finally had their suspect. When Turner got the call confirming the match, she drove to Lacey's mother's house herself. Darlene opened the door slowly, wearing a worn cardigan and holding a cup of tea. Turner sat across from her and said softly, "Ms. Coleman, we've identified the person responsible for Lacey's death." For a long moment, Darlene didn't speak. She just stared at Turner, as if trying to understand words she'd waited nearly 2 decades to hear. Then finally she whispered, "You found him." The tears came before Turner could even answer. On December 7, 2023, authorities in Birmingham arrested 47-year-old Brian Keith Haskins outside his repair shop. The arrest was quiet, deliberate. He didn't resist, didn't ask why. But when officers read him his rights and told him it was for the 2004 murder of Lacey Coleman, his face went pale. When news broke, Brookhaven erupted. The story led every local broadcast. "After nearly 20 years," one anchor said, "justice may finally be within reach for the family of Lacey Coleman." Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Old-timers in town said they never forgot that night. The missing posters, the vigils, the haunting photo of Lacey smiling in her blue graduation dress. In interviews, Sergeant Turner said something that echoed far beyond the small Mississippi town. "This case shows that time doesn't erase truth. It only waits for science to catch up." The district attorney's office worked swiftly to extradite Haskins back to Mississippi. His first court appearance took place in early January 2024. He was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. Dressed in a beige jail jumpsuit, his hair graying and hands trembling slightly, he stared blankly as the charges were read aloud. When asked if he understood, he muttered, "Yes, ma'am," but offered nothing more. The courtroom was filled with people who had waited half their lives for that moment. Friends from church, neighbors, former classmates. Darlene sat in the front row, clutching a handkerchief embroidered with her daughter's initials. When the judge denied Haskins bail, a quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. Relief, disbelief, and anger all tangled together. After the arraignment, Turner spoke briefly to the media outside the courthouse. "It took 19 years," she said, "but today we moved one step closer to justice for Lacey." Her voice cracked slightly on the word justice. Over the next few months, investigators reconstructed the night of June 12, 2004. Using old call records, witness interviews, and GPS data pulled from Haskins's delivery routes, they mapped his movements. It became clear that he'd likely seen Lacey at the gas station, offered her a ride, maybe pretending his truck had broken down, maybe asking for directions. Somewhere along that short drive home, everything changed. Forensic analysis of the evidence confirmed what prosecutors had long suspected. Fibers found on Lacey's clothing matched the interior upholstery of the delivery van Haskins used at the time. His employer's old maintenance records, recovered from storage, proved he was indeed driving that vehicle on the night she disappeared. Every fragment of the puzzle, once scattered and dim, began to lock into place. Haskins's defense attorney argued that the DNA evidence was tainted by time, that cross-contamination or degradation could have influenced results. But the state's forensic experts dismantled those claims. "This is not speculation," one testified. "This is the defendant's genetic signature, definitive and unique." By the summer of 2024, the case was ready for trial. Local papers called it Brookhaven's reckoning. For the Coleman family, it was the end of a long, sleepless chapter and the beginning of another. The trial began on July 15, 2024, inside the Lincoln County Courthouse, a red brick building that had seen generations of local cases, but never one that carried this kind of weight. Reporters filled the front row, their cameras flashing each time the defendant entered. The air inside felt thick, charged, not just with curiosity, but with 19 years of waiting. State of Mississippi versus Brian Keith Haskins. The courtroom went still as Judge Rebecca Miles entered, her gavel striking once. Haskins sat at the defense table in a dark suit provided by his attorney, his hair thinner now, face hollow, eyes flat. Across from him, the Coleman family sat shoulder to shoulder. Darlene in the center, her hands trembling slightly as she held a rosary. The prosecution began with a single photograph, Lacey, smiling in her senior year portrait. "This is who we're here for," District Attorney Thomas Grady said, his voice steady but heavy. "Her daughter, a student, a friend, whose life was stolen. For 19 years her family carried that silence. Today the silence ends." He walked the jury through the evidence piece by piece. The DNA found under Lacey's fingernails, the matching fibers from the van, the GPS logs, and the timeline that placed Haskins within yards of her last known location. Each fact built on the last, brick by brick, until a picture began to form that no one could ignore. Then came the witnesses. Sergeant Michelle Turner testified first, explaining how the genealogy match had led to Haskins. "It wasn't luck," she said. "It was persistence, and science finally catching up to what we always suspected, that someone out there knew exactly what happened to Lacey." The defense tried to sow doubt, pointing to gaps in the old investigation, and claiming the evidence had sat too long on a dusty shelf. But the prosecution countered with modern lab results confirming the DNA match was exact, not partial, not degraded, but a full genetic identification. "Time didn't erase his guilt," Grady said. "It preserved the proof of it." Midway through the trial, the jury heard testimony from two of Lacey's former co-workers. One remembered seeing Haskins at the store often, making deliveries, chatting a little too long at the register when Lacey was working. "He gave me the creeps," she said quietly. But back then you don't want to assume the worst. Then came the hardest day, when the medical examiner took the stand. Photos of the crime scene were displayed on a large screen, and the courtroom fell silent, except for the hum of the projector. Darlene pressed a tissue to her face, unable to look. The examiner described the injuries, the evidence of struggle, the DNA findings. "Whoever did this," he said, meant to silence her. Haskins showed little emotion throughout. He sat motionless, occasionally whispering to his lawyer. He never looked toward the Coleman family, not once. But during one particularly tense moment, as a photo of Lacey's recovered bracelet was shown, a small flicker passed over his face, a tight swallow, a shift in his jaw. It was the only crack anyone saw. The defense called no witnesses other than Haskins himself. When he took the stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. He spoke in a low, even tone, claiming he didn't know Lacey, that he was being framed by faulty science. But under cross-examination, his story began to unravel. Confronted with his own root logs and DNA results, he stumbled. His answers grew short, defensive. "I didn't do anything," he said repeatedly, his voice rising slightly. "I didn't touch that girl." But the evidence told another story, one the jury couldn't ignore. After 2 weeks of testimony, both sides rested. The prosecution's closing argument was quiet, simple. "Justice is patient," Grady told the jury. "It took 19 years, but it found its way here today. Lacey fought for her life that night. We know it from the DNA under her nails. The least we can do is fight for her now." The jury deliberated for just under 7 hours. When they returned, the courtroom went silent again. The foreman stood, hands shaking slightly, and read the verdict. "Guilty on all counts." A gasp rippled through the room. Darlene's sob broke the silence first. Raw, unrestrained, years of grief finally finding release. Turner placed a hand on her shoulder as tears filled her own eyes. Haskins sat expressionless as the judge thanked the jury and ordered him into custody pending sentencing. When court adjourned, the hallway outside erupted in emotion, hugs, tears, and whispered prayers. Reporters crowded around Darlene, but she said only one thing. "My baby can rest now." The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. Judge Miles listened as the prosecution recommended 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. When Darlene was invited to speak, she stood slowly, clutching a folded piece of paper. Her voice trembled but stayed clear. "For 19 years," she began, "I woke up every morning wondering if anyone still remembered her name. I prayed that God would let me see this day before I leave this world. I don't hate you, Mr. Haskins. I pity you. You took my child's life, but you didn't take her soul. She's with me every day." When she finished, the entire courtroom was silent. Even the judge seemed to pause before speaking. "Justice delayed," Judge Miles said softly, "is still justice delivered." She sentenced Haskins to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no reaction as deputies led him away. Outside, the courthouse steps overflowed with community members holding candles and photos of Lacey. Cars honked as they passed, people crying, some cheering quietly. Brookhaven hadn't felt this unified in years. That night, local news carried the story across the state. 19 years after her disappearance, the anchor said, justice has finally come for the Coleman family. Darlene didn't watch the coverage. Instead, she sat on her porch listening to the night sounds. The same Mississippi crickets, the same warm wind that had carried her daughter home so many nights before. She looked up at the stars and whispered, "It's over, baby. It's finally over." In the months following the verdict, Brookhaven began to change in subtle but meaningful ways. It wasn't immediate. Grief never lifts overnight, but there was a new quietness in the air, a kind of peace that had been absent for nearly 2 decades. The Coleman family's porch, once the center of vigils and prayer circles, became a gathering place again, not for mourning, but for remembering. Neighbors would drop by with coffee, pound cake, or just a chair to sit a while. Sometimes Darlene would tell stories about Lacey, how she'd sneak extra whipped cream into milkshakes at the diner, how she could never stay mad at anyone for long. "She was light," Darlene would say softly. "Even in that last picture of her you can see it. She's shining." For years the town had carried the weight of her disappearance like a scar that never quite healed. Parents told their children not to walk home alone, to lock their doors early, to stay in groups. Now, with the truth finally laid bare, that fear began to loosen its grip. The sheriff's department saw it too. Detective Michelle Turner was promoted soon after the case closed, but she didn't leave town. She stayed in Lincoln County, training younger officers on the very cold case methods that had solved Lacey's murder: genealogy tracing, cross-agency DNA pooling, and digital evidence reconstruction. "If we could bring one family peace after 19 years, she told a group of new recruits, we can do it again." She kept a framed copy of Lacey's school photo on her office wall, not as a trophy, but as a promise. Around the same time, the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation launched a new initiative, Project Resolve, aimed at reopening cold cases across the state using modern forensic techniques. It was funded partially by a federal grant that came after national coverage of Lacey's case drew attention to Mississippi's backlog of unsolved homicides. The first family to benefit was the Thompsons in neighboring Jefferson County, whose daughter, missing since 2005, finally had her remains identified through the same genealogy database that caught Haskins. "It was like a door opening," Turner said in an interview that aired statewide. "Lacey's case reminded people that time doesn't erase evidence, it just waits for someone to look again." Meanwhile, Darlene began volunteering with a group called Voices for the Missing, which connected families of cold case victims across the South. She'd drive to Jackson twice a month, wearing a small silver pendant with Lacey's initials, and sit across from mothers who were still waiting for answers. She never gave them false hope, just her story. "I thought my heart was going to stop beating before I saw justice," she told one woman during a support meeting. "But you can't give up. Sometimes it takes the world a while to catch up to the truth." In early 2025, nearly a year after the conviction, a local filmmaker approached Darlene about producing a short documentary on the case. At first, she hesitated. "I don't want her story to be about what he did," she said. "I want it to be about who she was." The filmmaker agreed, and the result was Light on the Tracks, a 20-minute feature that premiered at the Jackson Film Festival that spring. The film opened with Lacey's voice, taken from an old home video, laughing as she held a disposable camera up to the lens. "Smile," she said to her mother. The audience fell silent. When the credits rolled, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Reporters from across the region revisited the story in the months that followed. Some focused on the science, the power of DNA and genealogy to revive justice in forgotten cases. Others focused on the humanity, the mother who refused to give up, the detective who never stopped calling labs, the small-town community that rallied through decades of uncertainty. One article in the Clarion Ledger ended with a line that struck Darlene deeply. "In Brookhaven, justice didn't come fast, but it came faithful." She clipped that article and framed it, setting it beside Lacey's photo on the mantel. Every morning she'd touch the frame before making coffee, but even with closure, the ache remained. "Justice isn't peace," Darlene said in an interview later that year. "It's just the first deep breath you take after holding it for too long." Around town, reminders of Lacey lingered everywhere. The old diner she worked at had changed hands twice, but still kept a photo of her behind the counter. The local high school started an annual scholarship in her name for students pursuing journalism, inspired by her dream of becoming a writer. Each year, Darlene would hand the award to a graduating senior, smiling through tears as she said, "Go tell the truth." That's what Lacey wanted. Detective Turner attended every ceremony she could. She often said the case taught her more about faith than any sermon. "We deal in facts," she told a local news station, "but sometimes it's faith that keeps you looking long enough to find those facts." In late 2025, Turner and a small team reopened 3 more cold cases in the region using similar DNA tracing. One from 1999 yielded a new lead within months. The ripple effect of Lacey's case was undeniable. It had changed how the entire state looked at old files collecting dust in storage rooms. Meanwhile, Haskins sat in Parchman State Penitentiary, serving his life sentence. He filed an appeal, claiming procedural errors, but it was denied by the state court. Those close to the case said he rarely spoke, kept to himself, and showed no remorse. Turner didn't care to know. "He's where he belongs," she said simply. That's enough. One night that November, as autumn settled over Mississippi, Darlene stood on her porch watching the sunset. The sky burned orange and violet over the pine trees, the same horizon her daughter used to photograph. The world had kept spinning, years blending into one another, but for the first time in 19 years she felt still. A neighbor's child ran across the yard chasing fireflies, giggling, the sound echoing faintly like something from the past. Darlene smiled softly, whispering into the air, "You see, baby, life goes on." Later that week she visited the small memorial near the train tracks where Lacey's belongings had been found all those years ago. Someone, she never knew who, kept the flowers fresh. She laid a single sunflower down, brushed a bit of dust from the marker, and whispered, "You're remembered. Always." As she stood there, she noticed the reflection of the sunset. In the metal tracks, 2 golden lines stretching endlessly into the distance. For the first time, they didn't look like the place where something ended, but where something began. That's what the Coleman family had given back to Brookhaven, not just a sense of justice, but the reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, still rises. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it takes science, but most often it takes love, the kind that refuses to stop asking questions. And somewhere, maybe in the way the evening light bends through the trees or in the quiet hum of the tracks. At dusk it felt like Lacey was still there, watching, smiling, finally at peace,